Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am Sarah Rosen-Mortel. I have the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and of getting to welcome you and say thank you for joining us to hear from some of the contributors to an important new book, The Black Agenda. Before I jump in, I'm going to do a few of the typical housekeeping notes that we've all gotten used to now in this kind of pandemic world. The event is being recorded, and we will make the recording and all of the relevant links available online after the event. We have turned on live captions, and if you want to turn them off, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. All participants here are muted, but please join the conversation. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll be sharing a link to a post-event survey, and we ask that you share your feedback with us. It really helps us and the panelists to hear what you're thinking about and to shape what we work on in the future. And if you'd like to join the online conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban so everyone else can find you. I also want to say a special thanks to the most important folks for today's conversation, the experts that we've assembled here, Kristen Brody, Brodys Marshall, and Preston Mitchum. All of them are contributors to the Black Agenda and will be joining the conversation. And we'll hear a more proper introduction to them in a little bit. The conversation today is going to be moderated by Urban Institute's own Shena Ashley, who is Vice President of Urban's Office of Race and Equity Research. And we will hear, of course, from Anna Gifty Apoku-Gaiman, co-founder and former president of the Sadie Collective, and importantly, the editor and inspiration for the Black Agenda. I've had a great pleasure of working with Anna through Urban's partnership with the Sadie Collective. And if you don't know Sadie, it's a nonprofit organization that addresses pipeline and pathway problems in economic, finance, data science, and policy, particularly for Black women. Sadie has an annual conference, which we're very proud to support, and it's coming up on February 19th and 20th. So I encourage you to check it out on the Sadie Collective's website. Anna, it is really great to see you, and I want to thank you for bringing your book colleagues to this conversation with us at Urban. Reading the foreword, I was really struck by some truths that you state really clearly and well in the Black Agenda. You call the book a love letter to Black experts. And you think about how we can demonstrate that Black scholarship can and should inform discourse that disproportionately affects Black lives. This book, it seems to me, is about the importance of valuing the unique contributions that can come from the intersection of the expertise of so many talented Black scholars and their own experience. What you describe, Anna, as acknowledging the added insights that come from the difference between studying racial inequality and living through it. Discourse today in some quarters is beginning to acknowledge the importance of lived experience, yet not enough of that conversation is valuing a combination of lived experience and expertise that exists in a growing number of Black experts on many of the issues touched on by this book. And in some ways, the book is an attempt to insist on valuing those experts and their ideas. And we're going to get to hear about some of them today. For our work at Urban, that means valuing our own Black experts and also deploying research, technology, and data science for what we call racial equity analytics, to interrogate structural racism and provide decision makers with the tools and insight they need to take into consideration whether the policy choices they're considering might exacerbate or mitigate gaps that have been built by centuries of racism and harm. Shena Ashley, who will moderate our conversation today, and many of her colleagues at Urban are using these kinds of analytic tools to look at income inequality, wealth inequality, and inequality in access to so many of the underpinnings necessary for mobility in America. And we're very excited to build tools that we hope can strengthen policy and practice and improve the conversation and lift up the voices of expertise that exist across many dimensions of difference. And so we are all excited to hear what we can learn today from these experts today. So I'm going to turn it over to Shena to start the conversation, and let me just say thanks for joining the conversation, and once again I hope you'll join it with us online get others excited about it as well, using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Shena?
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that intro, and it's a great warm welcome to this discussion. As Sarah highlighted, this book being a love letter to Black experts. And in reading the book, I definitely felt that and felt so seen for the multiple kinds of expertise that I've been allowed to bring to the work and that we've allowed to flourish through the research and analysis that we do at the Urban Institute. And now I'm so privileged to be able to have this time to be in discussion with some of the experts from the Black agenda. I am going to be joined in discussion by Kristen Brodys, Senior Economist and Associate Director of Economic Mobility at the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank, Brodys Marshall, Principal, Brodys Marshall Consulting, LLC, and Chief Executive Officer of Data edX. Love another data expert. We can geek out on that, Brodys. Preston Mitchum, Adjunct Professor of Law at American University, Washington College of Law. Welcome all of you to this webinar. Cannot wait for this amazing discussion that we are going to have. I'm sure it's going to enlighten so many on the possibilities that we have in advancing racial justice and equity in public policy because of the expertise that you all bring across so many policy domains. This is going to be a wide-ranging conversation that may be very difficult to contain in the next 40 minutes, but I hope it just sparks ideas and creativity in those who are joining us today, and that they share this conversation across on social media so that we can keep it going beyond this time together. I'm going to start with a question that just grounds us in data and evidence. And if you don't mind, Brodys, I'll start with you, really looking at this time that we've been in. COVID-19 has spotlighted and exacerbated the extent of systemic racism in policies and practices, and all of us have seen this going on. I'd love for you to talk a little bit first about how you've experienced this and what data points that you've seen generated over the time in your policy domain has reframed the conversation in your area.
Wow. Woohoo, I'm so glad to get this started. So for me, COVID-19 has been turning everything upside down and inside out, because now all of the discriminations, all of the prejudices that we have known as Black people have now bubbled up to the top and infected and affected a whole slew of individuals who were keeping it hidden from themselves, who kept going. So for me, a lot of the data points is individuals who are now electing to live their lives more fully and more wholly. That means that there has been a move and shift in tech in particular about who is entering and how they enter. There has been a move and shift into who gets into grad schools as GRE bars have been lowered or removed. There has been a conversation about what is the value placed upon experience and especially domain expertise, not just credentialing. And I think these are all now new ways in which we as Black people can walk into a space and feel a little bit more welcomed. Not saying that we're fully welcomed, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, but just so that we feel more welcome into spaces, particularly white spaces. So I'm gonna stop my comments there because I want the other panelists to
That is
chime
perfect.
in.
Yes, Preston, why don't you chime in on that? What are the data points in your area that are resonating particularly and sort of grounded the context for the work that you presented in the Black agenda?
Sure, I'm happy to continue along this same line of thought, and thank you so much, Brodys and Urban Institute, for the invitation. So the expression of when white America gets a cold, Black America gets the flu has always rang true. But for many people, of course, rarely has it resounded so loudly and significantly as it has during the pandemic. That expression in particular shifted from words to reality time and again. And we saw stark disparities in education, in housing, in voting, employment, healthcare. And the particular section I wrote on is in regard to the criminal legal system. And of course, we saw continued disparities there. In the beginning of the pandemic, it's important to be clear around data. And since this is a data question, I'm happy to bring some to the light. So, for example, we saw the numbers being particularly devastating in Chicago. I'm from the Midwest, from Ohio, and we're not immune to that. So in Chicago, even though the city's population was just 30% Black in the beginning of the pandemic, a report found that 70% of the people who died from the virus were Black. In Detroit, where the population made up about 80% of the city, we saw that they increased Michigan's, the entire state's overall death rate by 40%. In Milwaukee County, which is just 27% Black, 81% of those who tested positive for COVID were Black, are Black, I should say. That was and still because of racism, not race. And that distinction is abundantly clear and must be made important. It's because of pre-existing conditions, which we know are driven by food deserts and receiving lower quality life-saving care. It's because places where Black folks predominate, like the South and the Midwest, which we see a lot of HBCUs, for example. We saw Medicaid access was not expanded. Currently, actually, 12 states still have not expanded Medicaid access, 8 in the South, 3 in the Midwest. And then because policymakers didn't know what else to do, they decided to criminalize people, because when you don't know how to have a policy solution, you at least start with the criminal legal system. And so we saw Black people being criminalized vis-a-vis stay-at-home orders. And so again, my chapter in the Black Agenda was not about this specifically, but it spoke to the disparities that were even driven largely by what we're calling institutional harm. And it wasn't about a singular Black person, it was about Black people who were also LGBTQ. And that's of particular importance because it reminded me of an Audre Lorde quote: "We don't have single issue struggles, so we don't live single issue lives." And contrary to popular beliefs generated by false media narratives, LGBTQ people are disparately impacted by culturally competent healthcare. And when you put Black on top of that, it exacerbates the harm that we know many of our communities experience. And so what does all this have to do with COVID-19 and data and the chapter in the book in particular? Everything. You know, COVID-19's like really shined a light on the disparities that were already existing for centuries to come. And frankly, if we don't have a public health solution that's driven by data, criminal legal system will be the only solution that many policymakers seek to find.
Oh my goodness, so much there. Preston, thank you so much. Dr. Brody, would you like to weigh in quickly on this? I hate for us to start so much into disparities, but thank you all for indulging me and speaking my love language, which is data.
I guess I'll start with automation because that's always where I start. So my research at Brookings, and I became director of the Economic Mobility Project on the 8th at the Fed. So I'll be continuing this research there. But a couple of things. So you talked about the health impact, but there's also the economic impact. And I think one of the big things is broadband and who has access to broadband and how people are concentrated in jobs by race and gender determines who could work from home and who couldn't. And so my research found that Asian Americans, then white people, then Black people, and then Hispanic people were likely to be able to work from home. So Black and Hispanic people were much less likely to be in a position that could be done remotely. They were much less likely to have internet access, even if they were in a position that could be done remotely. They were more likely to be in an essential position. I'm not going to say low skill because I don't believe in that, but low wage job that did not have healthcare time off or childcare. So they're in a job like being a cashier or a waiter, waitress, something in food service that could not be done remotely, didn't have time off, has a low wage, is at high risk of automation within the next 5 to 10 years. So they are sacrificing their health and their lives and the lives of their children for a job that may not even exist, that can't be done remotely. And so my research focused on what HBCU specifically could and should be doing to prepare their students for jobs that will exist, pay a living wage, and provide benefits.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think it was wonderful as Sarah kicked us off to really talk about the intro to the book, saying why, Black expertise matters. And we have a very broad audience here who may have not seen the book yet. I encourage people to get it, but help us entertain that question a little bit. Why does centering Black expertise matter really in policy discussion? How is that also bringing racial equity and social justice into the conversation of public policy? Let's go with Preston. You want to start us out?
Yeah, I'm happy to start us out with just by saying the world will be nothing without Black people, right? Like, and I can put a period there, but of course I'll expound by saying that, I know this is probably interesting coming from a person with 3 degrees, but I think we must really begin with the question, what do we mean by expertise? Right, it's beyond the academy, it's beyond academics, it's beyond this warped perception of air quote Black excellence. And so when I engage my students and advocates and colleagues and policymakers, it's always important to explain that people are experts of their own experience. And sometimes this doesn't always look like what we've been forced to believe about expertise or what we've learned to believe about expertise. And we miss the mark a lot when we don't recognize people of lived experience. And it's probably amazing and not surprising to anyone certainly attending that most of the people who receive calls to have these discussions and similar discussions and/or who go to members of Congress or state legislators, they're always leading with accolades first, because that's what we've been taught to do, right? We've worked hard for them. Our student loan debt proves it. And so we lead with it a lot of times. And sometimes it's at the disadvantage of people who may have been removed because of lack of resources, among other things. And so it is always important, at least not for us to remove ourselves from the conversation, but to add other people who may not have the same background as us into the conversation. And that is important, right? Because when we talk to community members and folks on the ground, right, who do not have the academy behind them and supporting them, but have deeply held and valued lived experience, right, that shapes their reality, we must make sure that they're also centered and grounded in the reality of this conversation, right? And again, that's particularly true when systemic barriers get in the way. The last thing I'll say is centering Black expertise in a more holistic way with all of us, right? That doesn't limit what Black excellence can mean, allows us to really enter into these conversations, no matter how difficult or challenging or uncomfortable. And it allows us to speak to the people who are not only the first hit, but oftentimes the hardest hit by injustices and systemic harm. But also, I'll go back to my first statement by saying, without Black people, the world will be nothing.
Very nice, thank you. And that bringing that lived experience, we all bring that with us. We're bringing all of our cousins and uncles and everyone into these discussions with us. Exactly. Brodys, how about you adding to that discussion?
Oh, Preston started us off right. Thank you, Preston. So I like to focus on the Black part because we are in Black History Month right now. And the conversation around Black History Month always tends to focus on the historical achievements of Black people. But in the Black agenda, which I found so powerful, is that it's really centering us living the current individuals that are having these conversations, what's going on right now, right? And it's not as though we are forgetting the past. In fact, we're building on top of the past, because historically we have seen this before. Our ancestors, our generations 100 years ago was dealing with this exact same influxion of, I call it algorithmic assault, but they had physical assault with lynching, with trying to move individuals outside of the legislature, not seating people who had been elected, right, at the time in the late 1800s, right? There is the introduction of Jim Crow, right? And now we're dealing with Jim Crow 2.0. So now in the Black agenda, as part of this, you have now all of these different individuals who are Black talking about how all of the discrimination has now morphed and massaged and mutated into what we're dealing right now, which is the technological infrastructure and that data harms that are happening. So that's what my chapter talks about, is really the Black part and what Black people need to wake up to if they don't already know, but also to be aware that we are being assaulted digitally within these systems, from criminal justice to facial recognition, to how we're even engaged in hiring practices. Let me not get started on that, because I will go a certain place. but we are in systems and we're digitized in ways that we're being weighted and evaluated against a norm that does not have us in mind. So the Black part in this Black agenda, I think, is where we need to center, because yes, without Black people, the word would have no texture, would have no seasoning, would have no flavor. And that's what we bring. We bring all of that to everything. And in technology in particular, we bring that texture every single time, all day long, without fail, in multiple roles. So this digital realm is one that is new to the discrimination that we're facing, but definitely not old. So
Great. Definitely going to circle back to you to learn more about that AI bias in a second. Let's get an opportunity for Dr. Brodie to jump in on this question of Black expertise, and your role as an academic as well. You've been creating and generating this. So let's hear your perspective on this question.
So I kind of gave the side eye when Preston mentioned student loans, because I have 3 degrees from 3 HBCUs and I never took out a loan. I don't have any student loans, no debt, thanks be to the Presbyterian, the Thurgood Marshall Foundation, and Alcorn State University and Jackson State University. 3 degrees, absolutely no loans. So praise God and the universe for that. And I think that's why I focus on HBCU. So I'm a 4th generation college graduate, 3rd generation master's graduate. My parents went to U of I and University of Chicago. My brother went to Hampton. My sister went to Howard, right? And so I wanted to go to a school that was right for me and that I could go to for free, right? And so that was Alcorn State University, right? And so I went from there to Jackson State. My MBA, I think I had out-of-state fees in the very beginning, but I worked somewhere, not a million hours either, right? So just, 15 hours a week maybe to take care of those out-of-state fees. And the PhD was free. We had an assistantship. So, and I'm not saying that all HBCUs have that. The public ones may cost less than the private ones. Please pick the one that's right for you. And if an HBCU isn't right for you, fine. But what I'm saying is that there is a way to go to school and get 3 degrees from Alcorn and Jackson State and end up being the director of the brand new economic mobility project at the Chicago Fed, right? So please don't say that it can't be done. I'm an example of it. And my research focuses on what are HBCUs doing? What majors are they offering? How do they prepare students? Are they not just having companies come in for jobs day and recruiting, but actually sharing information on what students need to know and be able to do to get a job at that company with automation being considered?
Thank you so much for highlighting the important role that HBCUs play in generating the Black expertise that's needed in these policy discussions, and providing these schools that provide the supports and the networks that allow people to thrive through that training so that they can land in these positions to be able to offer their expertise to policy discussions and generate the work that we so much need to develop the solutions that's going to address the issues that we still face. Definitely appreciate that. I'll turn now back to you, Brodys, because you started this discussion on your chapter around data equity and AI bias, and in the work that I do in the Racial Equity Analytics Lab, this is definitely something that is an issue that we focus on. What are some of the specific takeaways that you have from your chapter that you want Black communities to understand about how AI bias is manifesting, and what are some solutions, and probably those that are in policy solutions, to directly address the AI bias harm to these communities?
Oh, thanks for the question. So as Black people, we learn through living the existence of overt, prejudice and discrimination. We learn ways to accept dominant cultures, like notions of us, and especially in how we look at prejudices and discrimination, right? But we must break actually the cycle. Discrimination has gone viral, and that's really the takeaway from my particular essay in my chapter. In mainstream media and in scholarship, it's called algorithmic bias, it's called AI bias, and other variations. But I want us to understand this as algorithmic assault. It's a covert and overt digital stream of discrimination and bigotry, right? It's another system that was designed not in our favor, another system not designed with us in mind. So I propose that we as Black people really do our due diligence and invest in learning about technology, about automated decision systems, and how they impact us, not just because we want a tech job. That's not what I'm advocating for. Even though if that's what you want to do, go do that. But understand what is happening inside of this digitization that we're now a part of, that we're not sitting at the table any longer, because we need to combat the severity of the influences of algorithmic systems, because they are criminalizing us in many different facets that we are completely unaware of until we are trying to get a housing loan, until we are trying to understand, why didn't we not get that particular loan for our business? What's happening inside of our taxes? Not until those external physical world things that happen do we then understand how we're counted as, rows and columns and the numbers and how we're weighted. So we need to invest in our whole bodies. Our humanity and our dignity is on the line here. Where other communities, they invest a toe in it, they invest a finger in it, they invest maybe an arm in it, but it is our whole bodies. And so that's what I'm imploring our communities to do. And that is reading books, that's coming to talks like this, that is investing in some of the online resources, especially within the digital space, tech space, data space, AI space. There's lots of free resources and a lot of Black people who are now talking about it, who are educating others. And so be open to the education of it. We need these digital smarts, not just the street smarts or the book smarts, but we need the digital smarts. So that's what I'm imploring us to do for us, so we can now navigate this whole digital stream in a whole new way, because we need a whole new playbook.
Yes, please, Dr. Brodie, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I think that that's another area of research for me, looking at banks in Black communities and how they've started to disappear. And so there have been these discussions about how layaway works versus, say, pay in four, or earned wage access versus a payday lender. And so I think Dr. Marshall brings up this really good point that just because whatever it is online doesn't mean that it's not discriminatory, right? That it's not about walking into a bank or a store and someone not speaking to you or following you around or using a racial slur even, right? Like, we hate to see it, but we recognize that when we walk in that store. We know. And we can tell each other, don't shop at that store because those people were rude. We know exactly what that looks like. But we don't know as much with what she's talking about in terms of these algorithms, right? Like, it's much less easy to identify racism and bias in those settings. And so I think that's why what she said is really important, because we don't see it visually, we don't hear it as a tone of voice. So I think that's really, really important.
Absolutely. These points are definitely resonating on social media. We encourage you to use hashtag the Black Agenda Book to continue this conversation on this, as we're seeing great dialogue already happening on this topic. Preston, let me turn to you. We're starting to see this conversation becoming more visible, but let's turn to invisibility at the moment. Your essay talks about how the invisibility of Black LGBTQ folks has contributed to misperceptions of the community throughout US history. It's not a current thing. How does the current state of the criminal justice system erase LGBTQ individuals? And what are concrete solutions to address this erasure of Black LGBTQ individuals?
So before I continue, I do want to say, in a very obviously joking way, my second degree was from a HBCU, and unfortunately, I had to take out loans. But but I do want to name that at least. But I appreciate that, and I really do love hearing Dr. Brodys' story because it's really a beautiful reflection of so much diversity in the Black community because our experiences aren't monolithic. And so just thank you for that. And Dr. Marshall, I kind of want to go back to your statement to bring in this conversation related to, you mentioned the whole body. And that is something that is really important to note when we talk about the experiences of Black people broadly. But what happens, right, when you have multiple marginalized identities, and what does that actually mean as law and policy interacts with your body? And so my essay really takes a further look at that because what people may not know, and this helps us get to solutions, is that LGBTQ people, particularly Black LGBTQ people in the criminal legal system, they're often an untold story in the mainstream, right? From media to very larger conversations. LGBTQ people in particular are widely overrepresented in the criminal legal system, starting with being a youth in the juvenile justice system. And even during incarceration, LGBTQ people, especially queer women and transgender people, experience inhumane treatment from the start, and that's by no accident. It doesn't also look like what we traditionally know to be police and policing. And again, it expands to these wider institutions. And so my chapter speaks about 6 particular institutions that we need to really focus on and provide solutions for each one. For example, I think many of us may know that LGBTQ bars have historically been raided by law enforcement, but it wasn't just the Stonewall riots in 1969. We saw uprisings in Cooper Donuts. We saw uprisings at Compton Cafeteria and the Black Cat Tavern, all because law enforcement officers were raiding LGBTQ bars for no other reason, just to destroy safe spaces. And so it wasn't just a thing of 5 decades ago, right? We actually see something happening in 2020 in Des Moines, Iowa at the Blazing Saddle. So again, what we must do is actually train, not law enforcement. I'm over this day where we're training law enforcement. What we can do, however, is actually provide interventions to the people who are actually front and back bar staff. We can actually make sure that they're invested in to ensure that there are certain services that people know how to properly intervene without actually causing or exacerbating harm and violence, and talk about that a bit more. The second thing, and I'll speed some of this up, but the second thing is around HIV criminalization. So what if I told you that in most of the states in the United States, people living with HIV can be arrested or jailed just for having HIV, and someone saying that they, quote unquote, recklessly infected them or attempted to infect them with HIV. It's a nearly impossible standard to prove, but people like Michael Johnson in Missouri was one of the people who's caught up in the HIV criminalization statute. And I want to be clear, his conviction was overturned, which was originally 25 years. It was overturned, however, because guess what? Prosecutor misconduct. That's also a part and parcel of the policing system or institutions. Homelessness and LGBTQ people, unfortunately for many, go hand in hand. And these young people are routinely criminalized through panhandling, through begging, among other things, again, which are statutory in nature. And people can be arrested and jailed for the mere act of poverty, right? And this deeply applies to people who are LGBTQ, but especially who are Black and LGBTQ, who unfortunately may be kicked out of their homes, experience family rejection, and more likely to be in the streets. And then what happens? You interact with law enforcement more. The fourth is just the general mistreatment of non-binary and trans young people, particularly in healthcare settings. And that's especially true when race compounds with sexual orientation and gender identity. School pushouts. I'm reminded of Nigel Shelby, a 15-year-old boy who died by suicide, who should have had his 18th birthday 2 weeks ago. He died by suicide at 15 years old because he was being bullied in school for being Black, and the schools didn't do anything. And so when you think of institutional settings where most of us are reared, it's not just at the home, it's in the school. And so when you have things like people experiencing bullying in schools, but when people actually had COVID, people were at home and may have been at home with parents or guardians or siblings who didn't like someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. The last thing I say as it relates again to the entire body is historically queer people have been arrested just for having sex. just for having sex. There's a case that people may remember in 2003 called Lawrence v. Texas. What the untold story is that police officers broke into the home and saw two men having sex and arrested them for violating a statute in Texas. So again, as we're discussing solutions and what that look like, we must invest in actual interventions, positive behavioral support tools, and not punishment. The problem is we usually result with punishment first and then try to solve problems later.
And those create further problems because we're not seeing the whole person. Dr. Brodie, would you like to add anything on that point before we turn to you with a question about your chapter?
Yeah, so that point is so important to me. I think I'm not going to name the school, but I worked at a couple of schools in Georgia where that was really an issue, where you saw students living in their cars or sleeping on couches because their parents had put them out because they were gay. And so I guess if you look at my Twitter handle profile at KE Brodie, you'll see that at the bottom of it, I have my pronouns, doctor, she, and her. And I've gotten some pushback on that. And then the rainbow flag, right? I say doctor because of what Dr. Mitchum talked about in the beginning, that yes, we do have the credentials. But I put the flag there because it took me a long time to be able to come out. And again, I'm not going to name the schools, but I couldn't come out until I got tenure, right? The first time, right? I just wasn't comfortable because while schools said that they were welcoming of the students and there was an LGBTQ center for the students, they said they were welcoming of the faculty. There were people that didn't get hired or didn't get promoted because they were gay. Nobody would say that, but in those very quiet, closed door meetings, one administrator at a school that I will not mention says, you know, we don't need any more of those people around our students. We've got enough gay students as it is, right? I heard that. And that person didn't know I was gay, right? And I didn't have the courage at the time to say something because I didn't have tenure, right? And so the hot second that I got tenure, I was like, I'm gonna wave a rainbow flag, not just because I want to wave a rainbow flag, but like I want students to know that it's okay, that there is somebody that they can talk to if they're being bullied, if their parents are not being kind, or if some administrator says something. And when I became a department chair and a dean and whatever else I became, like that was always something that was really important to me because I didn't feel like that, right? Like my parents didn't put me out, but they weren't real happy that I was gay, right? Like, so I think that for any of us who are gay, bi, whatever word you want to use, if you feel comfortable letting your mentees know, letting your students know, letting junior people and wherever you are know, again, if you feel comfortable and safe, so that they know that they're not alone, and doing whatever any of us can, straight people and whoever else, to be allies.
Very important points there. And you raise in that an important barrier for Black expertise coming through the pipeline, no matter what, tenure barriers and not being able to bring your whole self into workplaces as a real barrier. And one of the things we wanted to talk about that's very prominent in your chapter is on the barriers to STEM graduates. We know that we have folks coming through HBCUs and other programs with those skills, but there are real barriers for them going into those professions and really bringing their expertise to all the fields of addressing climate change, technology, all those things. Can you express some of those barriers that you describe in your chapter and solutions to those?
Yes, yeah, so I think the first thing that may not be in the chapter, but is in some work that I did at Brookings, is the racial wealth gap and why it exists. Right, so all of those things, wherever you want to start, if you start with passing down wealth from one generation to the next, we know that Black people have less wealth to pass down in the first place, which means that they're less likely to be able to pay for their children to go to school, right? Like I was blessed that my parents could have paid for me to go to school if I didn't have the scholarships that I did, right? But it's not lost on me that their knowledge, the information that I gained from them as college graduates, meant that I knew what to do. I knew how to apply for scholarships, right? Like I knew where to look. These are things that everybody I know does not have, right? So we need to figure out through community centers and churches and however else we share information so that people who may not know myself and Dr. Marshall and Dr. Mitchum and you, ways that these young people can get this information and learn about all of the opportunities that are available. Everybody is able to learn if they have access. That could mean internet access. That could mean having a mentor. That could mean doing a college tour, be it virtual or in person. We need to make sure that everybody, all young people, get the information that they need to learn about the opportunities that are available.
Yes, Dr. Marshall, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
Oh, I'm going to try to keep this short because I know we're running short on time. But I will just say that when it comes to what is happening at HBCUs, as someone who has been at HBCU teaching from 2014 and now I'm on sabbatical this year, there is a real need in order to understand the plight of accessing education. And the fact that there's a lot of pressure in order to do well, and that there is a lot of pressure in order to get that degree in order to get a job that will pay them so they can pay back their student loan. So I want to circle back to this conversation, is that these students are accruing debt. They're accruing debt. And they are being put into a hiring system that is requiring them to spend most of their time not in the classroom, but in interviewing processes that are discriminatory. So I want to bring this out to light just a little bit more because this is an issue that has been compounding over 2 decades, but it's not just one round of interviews. It is 4, 5, 6 rounds of interviews. Students do not have time for this. They are accruing debt. They are in a classroom trying to gain knowledge. They are trying to get an internship so that they can make sure that their resume is on par with other people in their discipline. But if you think that HBCUs aren't producing the students at the caliber that you think they're producing, you are dead wrong. They are the hardest working, most intelligent individuals. They understand not only the work, but the nature of their work. So by not hiring them, you're doing yourselves a disservice because they know all of it and then can translate it to other divisions in your organization. But because the person doesn't look the way that you want, or has locks, or happens to be LGBTQ+, or happens to be a woman, you then assign to them that, oh, they came from an HBCU and they're not worthy. Dead wrong. And this is coming from someone that has all her degrees from PWIs. That's predominantly white institutions, if you do not know.
Thanks for breaking that down.
Let me break that down for y'all that don't know. So do not get it twisted. HBCU grads are top shelf. And you sleeping on them is part of your internalized white supremacy, not ours.
Yes, yes. Thank you. I will say yes to that with my HBCU degree. Could not have made it without it. Absolutely. Well, we have a number of questions that have come in from the audience. People are very much engaged in this conversation, and I'll ask people to continue to post their questions, and we can get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes that we have for this discussion. I cannot believe we already got to the point of questions. So much we can dig into here. I want to start one that I think is really pressing to me, given the work that we do around the federal government's executive order on racial equity coming from the Biden administration. And, you know, there was a question posed around this outside of the federal executive order. What else can federal agencies do now to start developing equitable policies and also policies that retroactively amend or abolish those that were rooted in racist practices in the past? And if anyone wants to jump in on that or want to take it, please do jump in.
Can I start, because I'm obviously not going to say much about the federal government considering my position, but one thing I will say is disaggregate data. Right, so data that's provided, disaggregated as much as possible so that so that policies can be developed based on who has the issue or who's going to benefit from it.
I will definitely +1 on that. And we'll also add to do that responsibly, right? In so many places, we do have small population levels. So when we disaggregate, we might be exposing harm or identifying individuals in communities that could put them at more risk for things. So also disaggregate to the extent that's responsibly possible to do that, while protecting people's privacy. And there have been so many techniques that have been advanced by scholars now in data privacy using synthetic data that helps us go through that. So I think the combination of data disaggregation and synthetic data practices to help us bridge that privacy concern, absolutely something that the federal government needs to do. Others thoughts on that?
I actually wanted to chime in on this one. I think not only disaggregating data responsibly, but also including people from the social sciences and humanities who have already scholarship in how to deal with small groups, especially when you disaggregate and there is a small group that you don't know how to deal with because it cannot be automated. You cannot stick it into some statistical framework and push an algorithmic button and go. So really understanding the line between what can and should be automated versus what needs to have the expertise and understanding from those who already have the knowledge base, the frameworks, the methodologies in order to deal with people on the fringe. And people that have been put on the fringe. So yeah. I want technologists to welcome in social scientists and humanities. And
the standard practice of many of us in the statistical space has just been to other those folks, right? It's a small group. We don't know what to do with them. Let's just drop them into a category of other.
And that's it. And that's where I have a little pushback when it comes to synthetic data sets, is that it is made up data. And that is part of a risk of bad information, which is perpetuating potentially, misinformation and disinformation campaigns that we have seen run rampant over the past few years. So synthetic data has maybe a place, but when it comes to people, which tends to be what the government is trying to reorganize and assess and categorize, synthetic data may not be the best approach. If it's empty in that cell, that is data. So leave it alone. I think that the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy is working on a Bill of Rights of AI. I think that is a good push in order to figure out what does that mean. Again, disaggregating data is important, including voices from many different backgrounds is very important as well. And I really think having a dialogue is important for people to understand what does it mean to have an algorithmic Bill of Rights, because people don't understand AI. They think it's just an algorithm. It's more than an algorithm. You have to look at the impact. You have to look at the outcomes. You have to look at the influences that that algorithm has. And it's not just for right now, which most people concentrate on. It is generational. The algorithms that are in place now is going to impact the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. So we need to right now this situation, not wait for the babies who are in kindergarten and middle school. I know everyone's talking about the kids. We need grown-ups, adults to upgrade their data cards, because what's happening right now is impacting the future.
We so desperately need that data bill of rights and around this technology is something that is important to bring in. Preston, you want to jump in on this?
I do, and brilliant. One thing that I've become clear on, particularly in doing government relations work, is that if administrations attempt to start speaking to people about their issues when they've been elected, then they've already missed community. And so the work really starts, frankly, on a campaign trail, which is obviously harder to do for someone who may be not a career official. But nonetheless, right, when you're on the campaign trail, your goal at that point is to really start engaging community to then figure out what practices you're going to adopt and where you're going to invest solutions in once you hopefully get elected. One thing I've learned, particularly around like data in particular with LGBTQ people, and this is something my mentor have always shared with me, is that when you're not counted, you just don't count. And so when I think about the disaggregation of data and how much we need it and how much we need it to be done responsibly, that actually means that data is being counted in the first place. The problem is for LGBTQ people, we're not in many spaces and not in many survey instruments. And so there's no widespread data collection form for LGBTQ plus folks, including with CDC, among other communities. That's especially true around mortality data. So we may know that LGBTQ people die for a variety of reasons, but we don't know how and why. We don't know how many people have been misgendered by their family once they do die or once they're killed. And so again, I'm always gonna beg for disaggregated data, but first I want data. Like, I want to even believe that we are counted and that we are appreciated to even be counted in the first place. And so what the federal government can do is really revisit their practices and policies to really see, are LGBTQ people being counted? Are you counting sexual orientation? Are you counting gender identity? Are you counting them in births? Are you counting them at death? Like, right, what is the range of experiences that you're actually having for queer, trans, and non-binary people? And unfortunately, again, the reality is that the vast majority of survey instruments for the government does not take into account the lived experiences of LGBTQ people.
This is so true. Yeah, go ahead.
1 second. So when I was with the Hamilton Project at Brookings, Mariah Macklin, who is a research assistant, started working on this research. And so to your point, there's not much, Dr. Mitchum, but there is this study. It's examining the economic status of same gender relationship households.
I wish that was the same thing, but it's not.
No. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it is, but this was a start, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm saying is that for somebody at Brookings to be doing that, right, and to be talking to the Department of Labor and others that, no, I agree with you, it doesn't exist, but those little pockets of people starting to do that research and you saying what you're saying here, right, means that hopefully we'll see more of that. I just want to promote that one study, because hopefully more people will do it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I really do pray that. I mean, the problem that we've oftentimes seen is there's no widespread data collection practice of it, which means that harm will continue to occur. And we do have widespread data collection practice for other communities. And so thankfully that there is, one, and that will eventually become more. But I do think that we need to continually make sure that the federal government is investing in more solutions. And the only way we can do that is by counting people so they can actually know what are their harms.
That is so true. And we received in the questions during registration also questions around how do we think about Afro-Latinx people and bringing more visibility to their conditions. And so, as we are thinking about disaggregating, also thinking about intersections across different parts of things so that we do that for many and more groups. So that's definitely something we should do. Last question here. We only have time for like 2 more minutes to get into a little thing, but this is something that you guys are starting to touch on already. And the question is, can data uplift / highlight personal stories rather than diminish them? Is there a way, as we're talking about adding more data and data disaggregation, that we can bring some how-tos around how do we use that data and communicate with it in a way that really tells the story of people and communities?
Yeah, I think I'll take this one really quickly. So between May and last month, I wrote a Jobs Day blog at Brookings. And so what I did was to look at by race and gender. So generally, when you hear the jobs numbers, it's the unemployment rate went from 4.0 to 3.9 or whatever. But we looked at, myself and Anthony Barr, and now Makeda Henry is doing it, to look at by race and gender over the last 3 months and over a 13-month period. And as I started doing that, CNBC would call me, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and whoever else. And so they started quoting those numbers because I was, right? Like before, nobody was talking about it. And I'm not saying that the big news agencies are, but CNBC started talking about it, right? So I think the more we promote these things and we say that they're important with these various data points, they will. And I believe the BLS is going to start reporting Native American data now as well. Right. So you just have to start somewhere, right? It's not going to happen overnight, but if we all push for more data or more inclusion, it does happen.
That's exactly right. And more people who are making decisions in communities out there have to be able to demand it, to say we can't design solutions without these data and we need the stories to be able to do this. This has been the best conversation of my day. This is incredible. Thank you all so much for bringing your expertise, Black and everything else that you bring to this conversation. I really appreciate it and hope we can have more discussions like this. I am now going to turn the mic over to the very gifted Anna Gifty, who is the editor of the Black Agenda, the book we've all been talking about. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. It was phenomenal to hear from the different experts who are featured in the book. And if you haven't already done so, definitely check out the Black Agenda, Bold Solutions for a Broken System at your local bookstore or anywhere that major retailers with respect to books are sold. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Urban Institute, especially Sarah Rosen-Wortel, president of the Institute, for recognizing the utmost importance of this policy conversation. It is my hope that this will not only be the only conversation featuring Black experts at the institution, and that in time, other institutions will learn from this example and do the same year-round. I also want to take this opportunity to thank each of the experts featured on the panel, to Preston Mitchum, Dr. Brodys Marshall, and Dr. Kristen Brody. Thank you for your incredible insights, both here today and in the book. The work each of you do for the Black community and the nation at large is incalculable. Thank you also to Shena Ashley for doing an excellent job in moderating this conversation. So at this point, many of you might be wondering, who is this 25-year-old girl on the screen with an incredibly dope background that is definitely staged? Huge shout out, by the way, to Cephalina and Matcha Interiors. I am Anna Gifty Opoku-Agyeman. I'm a graduate student pursuing my PhD at Harvard Kennedy School, a co-founder of the Sadie Collective, a proud alum of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Glen Oak Country School, and St. John's Parish Day School, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, and most importantly, a fan of all things Marvel. I'm also best known as the voice behind @It'sAfronomics on Twitter. And as of last week, I became a newly published editor of the Black Agenda book, Bold Solutions for a Broken System, which debuted on the first day of Black History Month. The book is the first and only collection of essays that exclusively features Black scholars and experts, the majority of which identify as women, from across the country for their perspectives on climate, education, healthcare, wellness, criminal justice, technology, and the economy. It is an attempt to shift Black voices to the center of the discourse. Truthfully, public discourse has long ignored Black experts who often understand how compounding crises are confounded by demographic and socioeconomic differences. For example, William Spriggs, an economics professor at Howard University, noted how the Federal Reserve missed early signs of the Great Recession because it did not listen to the warnings from Black economists. Today, Black experts are simultaneously hyper-visible and silenced, seen but not heard, acknowledged but not cited. The late W.E.B. Du Bois noted that the lives and works of Black scholars inevitably becomes part of public discourse, public life, and social commentary. Black experts, however, are often chastised for lacking objectivity and relevance on matters related to Black life and beyond, though for a very brief moment in 2020, it seemed that the mainstream might have finally begun to pay attention to Black expertise. Unfortunately, that moment went as quickly as it came, and we all bore the cost of that erasure. In 2022, the stakes could not be higher. As COVID-19 heads into a devastating third year, those with the most power can no longer ignore the wisdom of Black experts who continue to sound the alarms on pandemic-related issues that impact everyone. What you saw today from each panelist and our moderator is a glimpse of the future and a challenge for what is yet to come. There is no way we get out of these crises together unless the plight of Black America is central to the conversations happening across policy settings. What each of these panelists have described is how Black America is uniquely vulnerable to police violence, algorithmic assault, and the economic and job crises facing our workforce. And what this event makes a case for is how Black experts should be at the helm of policy conversations that touch every facet of society. As I always say, there is a fundamental difference between studying racial inequality and living through it, and we need experts who can do both. At the crux, if policy and industry leaders are truly determined to place equity at the center of politics and the survival of American democracy, Black experts can no longer be relegated to diversity, equity, and inclusion panels or Black History Month featurettes. This can no longer be the charge placed on Black experts who have always had so much more to offer the country and our world. It can no longer be that Black expertise occupies space on a conditional basis. This moment demands that individuals, institutions, and communities alike make equitable room for Black expertise on all matters. Every panel, every talk, every podcast, every article, every board, every council, and every organization. We need Black experts in every single thing concerning policy matters moving forward. The evidence presented in the Black agenda is a litmus test. It is a test to ensure that institutions and individuals alike honor Black life and Black expertise in the ways in which they conduct business in every facet of society. It is my hope that you recognize how this moment can be used towards catapulting Black people into every level of leadership. It is my hope that you see how the Black agenda aims to achieve something institutions have repeatedly failed to do, definitively illustrate why Black experts should be at the helm of public discourse on issues ranging from jobs to criminal justice to AI bias. All in all, there are no more excuses left. It is time to call in the Black experts. It's been time to call in the Black experts. So let's get to work. Thank you so much.